November 20th, 1944. Ormoc Bay, Leyte Island, Philippines. Second Lieutenant Yoshio Fukui folded the rice paper carefully, his hands trembling despite his best efforts at composure. Outside his tent, the pre-dawn darkness held the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. He had written the same letter 3 times already this month, each version more final than the last, but this morning felt different. This morning, American reconnaissance planes had been circling since 0300 hours, their presence a harbinger of something massive. Fukui slipped the letter into his flight suit pocket, next to his mother's photograph and a lock of his younger sister's hair. The photograph showed his family standing before their home in Osaka, taken in the spring of 1941, when the world still made sense, when Japan's victories seemed destined to continue forever. That world no longer existed. What replaced it was about to reveal itself with devastating clarity. At 0445 hours, the first pilot ran to the operations tent shouting about lights on the horizon. By 0500, every Japanese pilot, mechanic, and soldier in the Ormoc Valley was staring eastward at a sight that defied comprehension. The rising sun, Japan's sacred symbol, was being blotted out by something far more ominous. Aircraft, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They came in waves so dense they seemed to merge into a solid wall of metal, glinting in the early morning light. Lieutenant Fukui grabbed his field binoculars with shaking hands and began counting. Carrier aircraft mostly. Grumman Hellcats, Curtiss Helldivers, Grumman Avengers. He recognized their silhouettes from intelligence briefs that now seemed laughably inadequate. 50 aircraft, 100, 200. He kept counting, his voice growing hoarse as he called out numbers to the operations officer, frantically scribbling notes. 300, 400, 500. The count continued as formation after formation appeared over the Philippine Sea. Hellcats arranged in combat air patrols at staggered altitudes. Avenger torpedo bombers loaded with ordnance. Helldiver dive bombers carrying 1,000-pound bombs. Escort carriers launching additional waves even as the first groups approached their targets. By the time the count concluded, Japanese spotters had identified 872 individual aircraft converging on Ormoc Bay. 872. The number represented more aircraft than the entire Japanese Naval Air Force could currently field in the entire Philippine theater. More aircraft than Japan had lost at the Battle of the Philippine Sea 5 months earlier. More aircraft than most Japanese pilots would see in their entire careers, and they were all coming here, to this small bay on the western coast of Leyte, where Japan's last major supply convoy was attempting to reinforce the garrison. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Fukui understood immediately what 872 American aircraft meant. It meant the convoy would be annihilated. It meant the 3,500 Japanese soldiers aboard the transports would die. It meant that Fukui and his fellow pilots would die attempting to defend them. Most importantly, it meant that Japan had lost not just this battle, but the fundamental capacity to contest American naval air power. The mathematics were inescapable and absolute. The Japanese had promised their pilots that American industrial capacity, while impressive, could be matched through superior training and Bushido spirit. They had assured their airmen that quality would triumph over quantity, that skilled Japanese aviators could defeat numerically superior but inexperienced American pilots. They had insisted that Japan's defensive perimeter, though shrinking, remained defensible through concentrated aerial resistance. Every single promise was revealed as a lie in that moment when 872 aircraft appeared over Ormoc Bay. The context that made this moment possible stretched back 16 months to the battles that had systematically destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The turning point had occurred in June 1943, not with a single decisive battle, but through a grinding campaign of attrition that Japan simply could not sustain. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought June 19th through 20th, 1944, American carrier task forces had annihilated Japanese naval aviation in what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of aerial combat, American fighters shot down approximately 600 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 123 of their own. The exchange ratio of nearly 5-to-1 in America's favor was devastating enough. But the true catastrophe lay in the pilots lost. Japanese naval aviation in 1944 suffered from a fundamental flaw in its training pipeline. Pre-war Japanese naval aviators had received extensive training, often 2 to 3 years of instruction before being considered combat-ready. These highly skilled pilots had achieved remarkable success in the war's opening campaigns, but Japan's training infrastructure could not replace losses at the rate American offensives were inflicting them. By mid-1944, the average Japanese carrier pilot had fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. Most had never practiced carrier landings with a full combat load. The rigorous training that had produced the highly skilled pilots of 1941 and 42 had been abandoned in favor of rushed programs that graduated pilots with barely adequate basic skills. These inadequately trained aviators were being thrown against American pilots who averaged over 300 hours of training before reaching combat squadrons. American pilots practiced aerial gunnery until they could hit targets consistently. They trained in squadron tactics until coordinated attacks became second nature. They flew hundreds of hours in their aircraft types until flying became instinctive. The result was predictable. At the Philippine Sea, experienced American fighter pilots flying superior aircraft with better tactics massacred Japanese formations with horrifying efficiency. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero's advantages, outmatched Japanese fighters in nearly every performance category except low-speed maneuverability. American pilots, trained to exploit the Hellcat's strengths while avoiding situations that favored the Zero, achieved kill ratios approaching 20-to-1. But even more devastating than the aircraft losses was the destruction of Japan's remaining pool of trained pilots. The 600 aircraft lost at the Philippine Sea represented 600 pilots killed, captured, or so badly wounded they could never fly again. Japan's training pipeline could not replace them. By November 1944, when American forces invaded Leyte, Japanese naval aviation existed more as a concept than a reality. The Americans, meanwhile, had built a carrier force unprecedented in history. By late 1944, the United States Navy operated over 100 aircraft carriers of all types, 17 fleet carriers of the Essex class, displacing 27,000 tons each and carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, 9 light carriers of the Independence class, converted from cruiser hulls, carrying 30 to 35 aircraft each, over 70 escort carriers, smaller vessels displacing 10,000 tons and carrying approximately 30 aircraft, used primarily for anti-submarine warfare, close air support, and aircraft ferry missions. The mathematics were staggering. If each carrier operated at even 70% of its rated capacity due to maintenance and operational losses, the U.S. Navy could put nearly 7,000 carrier aircraft into operation simultaneously. Japan, by contrast, could barely muster 500 carrier-qualified pilots and aircraft across its entire remaining fleet, and those 500 were distributed across multiple theaters, never concentrated in sufficient strength to challenge American task forces. At Ormoc Bay on November 20, 1944, 872 aircraft represented just a fraction of American carrier aviation strength in the Philippine theater. Task Force 38, commanded by Admiral William Halsey, operated 16 fast carriers in 4 task groups. These carriers could launch over 1,000 aircraft in coordinated strikes. The 872 aircraft attacking Ormoc Bay represented approximately 85% of available aircraft from the task force, a maximum effort strike against a target deemed critical to Japanese defensive operations. The Japanese convoy attempting to reach Ormoc consisted of 4 transports carrying 3,500 soldiers of the 26th Division, escorted by 6 destroyers and 8 destroyer escorts. The transports were converted merchant ships, their thin hulls offering virtually no protection against bombs or torpedoes. The escorts were modern, well-armed warships, but hopelessly outnumbered by the incoming American air armada. Lieutenant Fukui's unit, the 201st Air Group, could muster exactly 31 operational aircraft that morning, 19 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, 8 Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, and 4 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. Many were damaged, patched together by mechanics working with inadequate parts and tools. None of the pilots had more than 6 months of combat experience. Most had fewer than 150 hours of total flight time. The orders came through at 05:15. All available aircraft were to intercept the American strike force and protect the convoy at all costs. Fukui read the message twice, then looked at his fellow pilots. He saw the same recognition in their eyes: 31 Japanese aircraft against 872 American planes. The mission was not a combat operation. It was a suicide directive dressed in military language. But orders were orders, and Bushido demanded obedience even unto death. At 05:30, Fukui climbed into his Zero fighter, a late-model A6M5 that had seen better days. The aircraft had been hit by shrapnel in a previous engagement, hastily repaired, and pressed back into service. The engine ran rough, the guns jammed occasionally. The radio was unreliable, but it could still fly, and on this morning, that was sufficient. The engines coughed to life across the primitive airfield. Fukui ran through his pre-flight checks mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He thought about the letter in his pocket, wondered if his mother would receive it, hoped his family would understand that he died with honor rather than futility. The distinction seemed important, though he could not articulate why. At 05:45, the first Zeros began their takeoff rolls down the coral-surfaced runway. Fukui's turn came at 05:52. He advanced the throttle, felt the Nakajima Sakai engine respond with familiar vibration, and released the brakes. The Zero accelerated quickly, its lightweight and powerful engine providing excellent takeoff performance despite the rough field conditions. Fukui's wheels left the ground at 05:53. He retracted his landing gear, trimmed for climb, and turned east toward the rising sun and the approaching American formations. Behind him, the remaining aircraft of the 201st Air Group struggled into the air, forming up in ragged sections as they climbed toward combat altitude. The American formations were clearly visible now, even without binoculars. They flew in precise combat boxes, fighters providing top cover at 20,000 feet, dive bombers at 15,000 feet, torpedo bombers at lower altitudes approaching from multiple vectors. The discipline and coordination were immediately apparent. These were not hastily trained pilots flying individual missions. This was a coordinated strike by highly trained aviators, executing a carefully planned operation. Fukui keyed his radio, though he suspected the transmission would be garbled. All aircraft, this is Red Leader. Enemy formations bearing 090, range approximately 40 kilometers. Fighters will engage enemy combat air patrol. Attack aircraft will target the bombers. Good luck to all. The response was a chaos of static, overlapping transmissions, and at least 2 radios that appeared completely non-functional. Fukui shook his head grimly. Even basic communication was beyond the capabilities of his decimated unit. How were they supposed to coordinate attacks against an enemy that flew with perfect radio discipline? At 0600 hours, the first American Hellcats peeled off to intercept the climbing Japanese formation. Fukui counted at least 40 fighters descending in a coordinated dive, splitting into sections of 4 aircraft each. Classic American tactics. Dive from superior altitude, make a high-speed pass, extend away using superior speed, then climb back to altitude for another attack. Never turn with a Zero, never slow down. Use altitude, speed, and teamwork to overwhelm the enemy. Fukui's handful of Zeros tried to maintain formation cohesion, but the discipline required for mutual support crumbled under the first American attack. The Hellcats came in at over 350 miles per hour, their 650 caliber machine guns opening fire at 800 yards. The volume of fire was devastating. Each Hellcat could put out over 4,000 rounds per minute. A 4-plane section could generate 16,000 rounds per minute of concentrated fire. The first Zero exploded in mid-air, hit by multiple streams of 50-caliber bullets that tore through its light structure and ignited its unprotected fuel tanks. The pilot never had time to react. One moment he was flying in formation. The next, he ceased to exist in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. The second Zero tried to brake hard left, but the maneuver bled off airspeed, and a following Hellcat caught him in a deflection shot. The Zero's engine disintegrated, and the aircraft entered a terminal spin, trailing smoke and flame. Fukui reversed hard right, pulling his Zero into a maximum G-turn that greyed out his vision and pressed him deep into his seat. The Zero could outturn any American fighter at slow speeds, its lightweight and excellent low-speed handling allowing maneuvers impossible in heavier aircraft. But the Hellcats were not trying to turn with him. They dove through the formation, fired, and extended away before the Zeros could bring their guns to bear. By 06, 05, 7 of Fukui's 19 Zeros had been shot down. 0 kills in return. The remaining 12 aircraft were scattered across 20 square miles of sky, all cohesion lost, all mutual support impossible. Each pilot fought alone, trying desperately to avoid the Hellcats that seemed to be everywhere, attacking from every angle, coordinating their assaults with professional efficiency. Fukui managed to get behind one Hellcat that had overextended during an attack run, but before he could fire, tracers from another Hellcat forced him into a violent, evasive maneuver. The Americans always flew in pairs, always covered each other, always denied him any opportunity to exploit a tactical advantage. It was like fighting a perfectly coordinated machine rather than individual pilots. Below, the torpedo bombers and dive bombers were beginning their attack runs on the convoy. Fukui watched in horror as the carefully orchestrated assault unfolded. Helldivers dove from 15,000 feet, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs with precision that demonstrated countless hours of training. Avengers came in at wave-top height, launching torpedoes from perfect attack angles that gave the destroyers no time to maneuver. The first transport exploded at 0612, hit by at least 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes simultaneously. The ship's back broke, and it began sinking immediately, fires raging through the split hull. Japanese soldiers jumped into the water, their screams inaudible over the thunder of aircraft engines and exploding ordnance. The second transport was hit at 0615, then the third at 0618. The fourth managed to evade the initial attacks but was cornered by a second wave of torpedo bombers at 0623. Within 15 minutes of the attack commencing, all 4 transports were sinking or already beneath the waves. 3,500 Japanese soldiers were dying in the waters of Ormoc Bay, and there was nothing Lieutenant Fukui could do about it. The destroyer escorts tried to defend themselves, their anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with shells, but the American formations were too large, too well coordinated, attacking from too many directions simultaneously. 2 destroyers were sunk outright. 3 more were heavily damaged and would sink before nightfall. The remaining escorts retreated westward at maximum speed, abandoning the soldiers struggling in the oil-slicked water. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 0630, the American formations began to withdraw, their mission accomplished with brutal efficiency. They had lost approximately 22 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire, and perhaps 3 to Japanese fighters. In exchange, they had sunk an entire convoy, killed over 2,000 Japanese soldiers, and destroyed most of a Japanese air group. The exchange ratio was approximately 100-1 in America's favor. Fukui's fuel gauge showed less than 1 hour remaining. His ammunition counters indicated he had fired perhaps 200 rounds during the engagement without scoring a single confirmed hit. Of the 19 Zeros that had taken off that morning, only 6 were still airborne and combat-capable. The torpedo and dive bombers had not even reached the battle before being intercepted and destroyed by American Combat Air Patrol. He turned west, toward the airfield, his hands trembling on the control stick. The letter in his pocket suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He had written it expecting to die in combat, achieving some measure of honor in his final moments. Instead, he had survived to witness complete helplessness. He had watched his comrades die without being able to help them. He had watched an entire convoy destroyed without being able to defend it. He had confronted 872 American aircraft and understood, with absolute certainty, that Japan had already lost the war. The landing back at the airfield felt surreal. Fukui touched down at 0720, his Zero's engine coughing and sputtering from fuel exhaustion. He taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for several minutes, unable to move. Around him, the 5 other surviving Zeros were landing, each pilot wearing the same expression of shell-shocked disbelief. The debriefing lasted less than 30 minutes. What was there to say? The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. 31 Japanese aircraft sortied, 7 returned. 0 American bombers destroyed, 0 transports saved, 3,500 soldiers dead. The mission had been a complete failure, and everyone in the operations tent knew it. Worse still, everyone knew it would happen again tomorrow and the day after, and every day until either the Americans ran out of targets or Japan ran out of aircraft and pilots. Major Takeo Shibata, the air group commander, dismissed the surviving pilots with a brief statement that avoided any mention of their performance. There was no point in discussing tactics or lessons learned. No tactic could overcome a 40-1 numerical disadvantage. No lesson could change the fact that American industrial capacity had made Japanese resistance militarily irrelevant. Lieutenant Fukui walked back to his tent in silence. He removed the letter from his flight suit pocket, unfolded it, and read his own words. "Mother, if you receive this letter, know that I died with honor defending our homeland. The enemy is strong, but our spirit is stronger. We will prevail through courage and sacrifice." The words felt like they had been written by a different person, someone who still believed the propaganda, someone who had not counted 872 American aircraft at dawn. He took out his pen and added a postscript. "I witnessed today what our leaders will not tell you. We face an enemy of unlimited strength and resources. They have more aircraft than we have pilots, more pilots than we have aircraft, more carriers than we have air bases. I do not know if Japan can win this war, but I know that I will do my duty until the end. Please care for Keiko. Tell her I thought of her in my final moments." He folded the letter again, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it with the squadron's outgoing mail. If he died tomorrow, which seemed likely, at least his mother would receive an honest account. The pattern established at Ormoc Bay would repeat throughout the Philippines campaign and beyond. American carrier task forces launched massive strikes against Japanese positions with overwhelming force. Japanese defenders, outnumbered and outmatched, died attempting to resist. The mathematics never changed. America could replace losses faster than it suffered them. Japan could not replace losses at all. The strategic implications of American naval air superiority extended far beyond individual battles. With complete control of the skies, American forces could land where they chose, supply their troops without interruption, and isolate Japanese garrisons from reinforcement. The island-hopping campaign that characterized the Pacific War became possible only because American carriers provided the mobile air superiority that made amphibious operations feasible. At Leyte alone, American carrier aircraft flew over 10,000 sorties between October and December 1944. They destroyed an estimated 1,500 Japanese aircraft, sank dozens of ships, and killed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. American losses totaled approximately 200 aircraft, mostly to anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. The exchange ratios demonstrated that Japanese aerial resistance had ceased to be militarily significant. The human cost of this industrial disparity fell most heavily on Japanese pilots like Lieutenant Fukui. They were sent into combat knowing they would likely die, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they faced enemies who could afford to lose 10 aircraft for every Japanese plane destroyed and still maintain overwhelming numerical superiority. Japanese pilots were fighting a war of attrition they had already lost. By December 1944, Japanese High Command began implementing kamikaze tactics. If Japanese pilots were going to die anyway, and the survival statistics proved they would, at least their deaths could inflict maximum damage through suicide attacks. The logic was brutal but mathematically sound from a purely military perspective. A trained pilot in a zero-cost Japan, approximately 100,000 yen and 2 years of training. A kamikaze pilot needed only basic flight skills and could be trained in 3 months. If that pilot could sink or damage a carrier costing millions of dollars, the exchange ratio favored Japan. Kamikaze attacks achieved some tactical successes, damaging or sinking dozens of American ships through the war's final months. But they could not change the strategic reality. America built ships faster than kamikazes could sink them. The Essex-class carriers, with their armoured flight decks and excellent damage control, proved remarkably resilient even when hit. Many returned to service within days or weeks. Japan's suicide tactics inflicted pain but not defeat. Lieutenant Fukui never became a kamikaze pilot. He died on January 15, 1945, shot down by Hellcats during another hopeless interception mission over Manila Bay. He was 23 years old. His mother received both letters 2 months later. The contrast between the first letter's patriotic certainty and the postscript's honest despair told her everything she needed to know about how the war was going. Japan officially surrendered on August 15, 1945, 8 months after Fukui's death. The Battle of Ormoc Bay has received relatively little attention in popular histories of World War II. It lacked the drama of Midway, the scale of the Philippine Sea, or the symbolic importance of Iwo Jima. But for the Japanese pilots who witnessed 872 American aircraft appear over the horizon that November morning, it represented something more profound than a military defeat. It represented the moment when the fundamental lie sustaining Japanese resistance collapsed into undeniable truth. Japan could not win a war of industrial production against the United States. Every promise that spirit and training would overcome material disadvantage was revealed as propaganda. Every assurance that Japanese defensive positions could hold against American attacks was proven false. The 872 aircraft over Ormoc Bay were not just weapons. They were physical proof that Japan's leaders had sent their pilots to die in a war that was already lost. The psychological impact of confronting this truth varied among Japanese pilots. Some, like Fukui, acknowledged reality while continuing to fight out of duty and honor. Others retreated into denial, convincing themselves that one more battle, one more sacrifice, might turn the tide. Still others embraced kamikaze tactics as a way to give meaning to inevitable death. Very few survived long enough to see the war's end and reconcile their experiences with the mythology they had been taught. American pilots who participated in strikes like Ormoc Bay generally viewed them as professional military operations rather than personal vendettas. They recognized that Japanese pilots were brave and skilled within the limitations of their equipment and training. But American aviators also understood that courage alone could not overcome the material and numerical advantages they possessed. Victory was inevitable because America could build, train, and deploy forces at a scale Japan simply could not match. The strategic bombing survey conducted after Japan's surrender confirmed what pilots like Fukui had realized at Ormoc Bay. Japan's industrial capacity had peaked in early 1944 and declined steadily thereafter due to American submarine warfare, strategic bombing, and loss of access to raw materials from occupied territories. By late 1944, Japan was producing fewer than 500 aircraft per month while losing over 1,000 to combat and operational causes. The deficit was unsustainable. American production, by contrast, exceeded 9,500 aircraft per month in 1944, including approximately 2,000 carrier-capable fighters and attack aircraft. The United States could lose aircraft at rates that would cripple Japan and barely notice the impact on overall force strength. This industrial disparity, more than any tactical or strategic decision, determined the Pacific War's outcome. The technological advantages American forces enjoyed by late 1944 were also products of industrial capacity, The F-6F Hellcat represented not just good design, but the ability to test, refine, and mass-produce an optimized weapon system. Each Hellcat incorporated lessons learned from combat analysis, modifications suggested by operational pilots, and improvements made possible by advanced manufacturing techniques. Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure to iterate and improve designs at comparable speed. American pilots also benefited from superior logistics and maintenance. Carriers operated with full machine shops, spare parts inventories, and trained technicians who could repair battle damage and perform preventive maintenance. Japanese forces, even when based on land, often lacked basic tools, spare parts, and skilled mechanics. Aircraft were kept flying through improvisation and cannibalization, resulting in declining reliability and increasing accident rates. The training disparity had grown to catastrophic proportions by November 1944. American pilot training programs graduated aviators with over 300 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, night operations, and carrier qualifications. Japanese programs had been reduced to barely 100 hours of basic flight training before pilots were sent to combat units, where they learned through trial and fatal error. This training differential manifested in combat effectiveness. American pilots could execute complex coordinated attacks, maintain formation discipline under fire, and employ tactics that maximized their aircraft's strengths while minimizing vulnerabilities. Japanese pilots often flew individually, lacked coordinated tactics, and made fundamental errors that experienced American aviators exploited ruthlessly. The kill ratios reflected this training gap as much as equipment advantages. The aftermath of Ormoc Bay also highlighted the humanitarian cost of military operations. The 3,500 Japanese soldiers who died when their transports were sunk represented not just military casualties, but human beings with families, hopes, and futures. Many drowned in the initial sinkings. Others died from wounds, exposure, or shark attacks while floating in the water. Some were rescued by Japanese destroyers or submarines. Most simply disappeared beneath the waves, their bodies never recovered, their families never certain of their fate. American pilots who participated in the attack later described feeling conflicted about the mission's success. Sinking transport ships filled with soldiers was militarily necessary but morally troubling. The pilots had not joined the Navy to kill helpless men in the water. But war permitted no distinctions between enemy soldiers aboard warships and enemy soldiers aboard transports. Both were legitimate military targets. Both had to be destroyed to achieve victory. The legacy of battles like Ormoc Bay extends into modern military doctrine. The principle of air superiority as a prerequisite for successful military operations was proven conclusively in the Pacific War. Every subsequent American military operation has prioritized achieving and maintaining control of the airspace above the battlefield. The ability to strike enemy forces while denying them the ability to strike yours remains fundamental to American military strategy. The importance of industrial capacity and logistics was equally well demonstrated. Modern militaries invest enormous resources in supply chains, maintenance infrastructure, and production capacity precisely because World War II proved that wars between industrial powers are won by the side that can sustain operations longest. Technology and tactics matter, but sustainment determines who remains standing when the shooting stops. The human dimension also resonates through military history. The Japanese pilots who wrote final letters home before flying against overwhelming odds demonstrated courage that transcends national boundaries. They knew they would likely die. They flew anyway because duty, honor, and loyalty to comrades demanded it. This courage deserves recognition even when it served a cause that history judged harshly. Lieutenant Fukui's letters, recovered after the war from his mother's possessions, are now preserved in the Japanese National Archives. They represent one pilot's evolution from confident belief to bitter understanding. The contrast between his early letters expressing certainty in Japanese victory and his final postscript acknowledging Japan's industrial inferiority provides insight into how combatants processed the gap between propaganda and reality. Similar letters from thousands of Japanese pilots tell the same story. Young men who believed their training and spirit would overcome material disadvantages discovered too late that modern warfare rewards production capacity and technological superiority over individual valor. Their deaths were not meaningless. They fought for comrades and homeland, but they were unnecessary. Japan's leadership sent them to die in a war that responsible analysis would have recognized as unwinnable. The 872 American aircraft over Ormoc Bay represented more than military power. They represented a fundamental difference in national capacity. The United States possessed the industrial infrastructure, natural resources, technical expertise, trained workforce, and economic system necessary to build carriers, aircraft, and weapons in quantities that overwhelmed any possible Japanese response. Japan lacked these prerequisites and could not develop them during wartime. This industrial capacity gap was not secret. Japanese planners understood before Pearl Harbor that American production potential exceeded their own by factors of 10 or more. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied in the United States and understood American industrial might. He warned Japanese leadership that Japan might win battles for 6 months or a year, but could not win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. His warnings were ignored. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was based on the assumption that a quick, decisive victory would force America to negotiate a settlement before its industrial advantages became decisive. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. America did not negotiate. It mobilized its full industrial capacity and devoted it to Japan's destruction. The result was inevitable from the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Everything afterward was just working out the details. For pilots like Lieutenant Fukui, understanding this truth came too late to matter. They spent their final months fighting battles they knew were hopeless, following orders they understood were suicidal, maintaining honor in circumstances that made honor seem irrelevant. The letters they wrote home reflected this tragic awareness. They knew they would die. They knew their deaths would not change the war's outcome. They flew anyway because the alternative, refusing orders, abandoning comrades, accepting dishonor, was unthinkable within their cultural context. The contrast between American and Japanese pilot experiences in late 1944 is stark. American pilots flew from comfortable carriers with excellent food, medical care, and recreational facilities. Between missions, they watched movies, played cards, wrote letters home, and knew that if they survived their tour, they would return to training commands or stateside assignments. Survival was expected. Death was the exception. Japanese pilots like Fukui lived in primitive conditions, often under fire, with inadequate food, medical care, and no prospect of rotation or relief. They flew until they died, which was usually measured in weeks rather than months. Survival was the exception. Death was expected. This psychological burden, combined with the knowledge that they faced overwhelming enemy superiority, created stress levels that Western militaries would have considered unsustainable. Yet Japanese pilots continued flying, continued fighting, continued dying through the war's final months. Their motivation came not from belief in victory. Few retained such illusions by 1945, but from deeper cultural values around duty, honor, and loyalty to comrades. These values sustained them even when rational analysis indicated their sacrifice was futile. Whether this represents admirable dedication or tragic waste depends on one's perspective and cultural framework. The final accounting of the Pacific Air War tells the story in numbers. From 1941 through 1945, Japan produced approximately 76,000 military aircraft of all types. The United States produced over 300,000. Japan trained approximately 60,000 pilots. The United States trained over 200,000. Japan lost approximately 50,000 aircraft in combat and accidents. The United States lost approximately 54,000, but could replace them twice over from production and reserves. These numbers explain why 872 American aircraft could appear over Ormoc Bay on a single morning in November 1944. They explain why Japan could field only 31 aircraft in response. They explain why the exchange ratio favored America by factors of 10 or 20 to 1. They explain why Japanese pilots wrote final letters home while American pilots expected to survive their tours. Industrial capacity determined everything. The lesson transcends World War II. Modern great power competition involves not just military forces, but the industrial, economic, and technological foundations that enable military power. A nation might field excellent weapons and highly trained troops, but if it cannot produce replacements faster than it loses them, it will lose a prolonged conflict. This principle shaped Cold War strategy, influences current defense planning, and will remain relevant for any future large-scale conflict. Lieutenant Yoshio Fukui, 23 years old, counting American aircraft until he reached 872, understood this principle through direct experience. The letter he added to his mother taught her what Japanese propaganda would never admit. His nation had challenged an industrial superpower and paid a terrible price for the hubris. His death, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, bought Japan nothing except eventual unconditional surrender. The tragedy was not that Japan lost. The tragedy was that Japan's leadership started a war they knew they could not win, then sustained it through propaganda and coercion, long after honest assessment would have recommended surrender. Every pilot, like Fukui, who died after mid-1944, died in a war that was already decided. Their courage was real, their sacrifice was genuine, but it was also unnecessary, demanded by leaders who valued national honor over national survival. The 872 aircraft over Ormoc Bay were not just weapons, they were harbingers of Japan's defeat, proof that American industrial might have overwhelmed Japanese resistance, and symbols of what happens when nations miscalculate the industrial foundations of modern warfare. Every pilot who witnessed that sight understood, at some level, that the war was lost. Some died still fighting, others survived to rebuild Japan from ruins. All carried the memory of that November morning when the sky turned dark with American aircraft and hope died. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.